Welcome to today's event, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the state of the world in 2022. Given what is happening in Ukraine at the moment, and that this is the second anniversary of the COVID-19 lockdown in the United States, there's no better person to bring to the stage than the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. But it's my distinct honor to introduce Prime Minister Bildt and the program to introduce today's introducer, the interim president of the university, Wendell Pritchett. President Pritchett received his PhD in history from Penn and has been in a number of roles at the university, including provost, associate dean for academic affairs, interim dean. He's a presidential professor. He was a friend of Perry Worldhouse even before he was provost. So we know that he likes us for real. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Wendell.
Thanks, Mike. So great to see everybody. We built this beautiful place with the support of Richard Perry, and it's been closed for a while, as you can imagine. It's so great to have all of you here in person, but also so great to have all of you who are joining us virtually today. So thanks to the phenomenal Perry Worldhouse team who are all running around right now to make sure everything works so well. You all make the most timely and enlightening global programming and resources possible, and what you do for our students and our entire academic community is truly priceless. So I'm just grateful to all of the Perry Worldhouse team and Mike for his leadership. And again, if you're online, we're glad to have you. So it's been nearly a month since Russia invaded Ukraine. We're glued to the events unfolding there, and our hearts and prayers are with all of those who are suffering. As individuals and as a community, Penn is closely engaged in aiding humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. As today's program makes clear, we've also been doing what Penn does best, which is bringing our university's academic power to bear so that we may better understand such enormously challenging and complex crises and hopefully contribute to some solutions. So one important way that we do this is with Perry Worldhouse Distinguished Global Leader in Residence program. That's a mouthful, which boasts among its current members our guest of honor today. Now, for a quick second, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and imagine something unthinkable. I want you to picture a world before email. Now, for many of you, that's an impossible thing to do. For some of us old people, it's really not that hard. But anyway, back when email was relatively new, back in 1994, our speaker took it upon himself to type up an email message and click send. Now, that might not sound terribly impressive, but the person that he sent it to was US President Bill Clinton, and it was the first publicly known electronic message shared between two heads of government. So times change and the world spins forward. The pioneering spirit and future-looking leadership of our honored guest makes that plain. As Prime Minister of Sweden, he led his nation in joining the European Union and reformed Sweden's economy. A renowned international diplomat, he has since served in numerous leadership roles, always with an eye towards building international peace and prosperity and to reducing conflict and the human suffering and loss that it engenders. He currently serves as the World Health Organization's special envoy for the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. And of course, Penn is thrilled to have him as global leader in residence. So I said a moment ago that times change, and it's mostly true. But what we've seen in Ukraine has taken experts by surprise, precisely because, in some ways, it feels so anachronistic. A ground war of this scale hasn't been waged in Europe since World War II. One of the biggest questions we now face is, what happens next? Or in the prophetic words of General David Petraeus speaking in 2003 on the Iraq War, tell me how this ends. To share his invaluable experience on these and other big questions, we are very pleased to have with us today Prime Minister Carl Bildt. Now, joining Carl in conversation is New York Times reporter and editor Clay Risen. Clay has also authored a number of critically acclaimed books, including The Crowded Hour, Teddy Roosevelt, The Rough Riders, and The Dawn of the American Century, a New York Times notable book of 2019, and a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Prize in Military History. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to both Prime Minister Bildt and Clay Risen.
Thank you for those kind words of introduction. Pleasure to be here under fairly tragic circumstances. Because a large-scale war has erupted in Europe. And we haven't seen anything of this sort since Adolf Hitler invaded Poland in September of 1939. Responsibility this time rests squarely with one person, Vladimir Putin. After more than 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks of war, the outcome remains uncertain. But one thing is clear: Europe and the world will not be the same. Consequences will be immense for a long time to come. But before offering some thoughts on what that might be, let me try to give you first some of the long background to the issue, and then go into developments leading up to Putin's aggression. The history of these large areas, the plains and the rivers of the east of Europe, isn't straightforward. When Vladimir Putin gives speeches on history, which he often does, he often goes back to the fact that Christianity was brought to the Eastern Slavic world by the Baptists of what he called Prince Valdemar in the spring of 989 in the city of Chersonus, the ruins of which can still be seen in the outskirts of Sevastopol on the Crimea. And from this, he derives his theory of the common destiny of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. But that very event, a long time ago, illustrates the complexity of the subject. Because the prince, who's called Vladimir in Russian, is called Volodymyr in Ukrainian, but in his childhood, with all certainty, listened to the name Valdemar. He was of the Scandinavian Viking family that had come to rule over and create a state along the river trading routes within the Baltic and the Black Seas, with the important cities of Novgorod and Kiev. And the Chersonus, where he agreed to be baptized, had by that time been a Greek city for more than 1,000 years. The early Rus state, that was his name, lasted for a number of centuries. And it was only thereafter that there started to emerge the state of Muscovy, with, among others, Moscow at the center, adopting the name of Russia only in the early 18th century. For centuries, what was to become Russia was under the tutelage of the Mongols, which was to emerge, and what was to emerge as Ukraine was to a large extent dominated by Poland and by Lithuania, and the open steppes to the south, the domain of the roaming Tatars and later the Cossacks. So when Putin in his speeches, also at the onset of the war, calls all of these historic Russian lands, is not only unhistorical, but outright delusional. True is, however, that these lands in later centuries come to be dominated by the strong Tsarist Russian Empire. However, with a strong Ukrainian national consciousness emerging, grounded in the very different historical background, this wasn't always an harmonious period. The Tsarist Empire, which seems to figure in the dreams of Vladimir Putin, was often known as the prison of nations. It was ruled by the Tsar in St. Petersburg, dominated by the Russians, but it included numerous nationalities that secretly, openly sought to shape their own futures. And when the empire collapsed in the wake of the First World War, and Russia, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, sank down in a brutal civil war, most of them, and certainly including Ukraine, declared their independence. Eventually, as we know, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious in the long civil war. And when they set up their Soviet state, they did so based on the fiction, as it was, of different national republics with a certain amount of autonomy. Some non-Russian nations managed to preserve the independence that they had declared, while some didn't, with Ukraine in the later category. When Putin, in his long rambling speech only a day before launching his invasion, set out his view on the issues, he singled out the Bolshevik leader Lenin as responsible for the cardinal sin of allowing the setting up of a separate Ukrainian state structure. The truth is, of course, that the Bolsheviks crushed the Ukrainian state that had been declared, but in setting up a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic had to accept and seek to accommodate the fact that the Ukrainian nation did exist. And when the Soviet state collapsed 7 decades later, history repeated itself, with all these captive nations that had not managed to preserve their independence after the collapse of the Tsarist Russia, now again declaring their independence. In a referendum on December 1st, 1991, 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence, with a majority in every single region of the country. The lowest support was on Crimea, but even there, 57% voted for an independent Ukraine. Only weeks later, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. There were certainly quite a number of difficult issues that were brought by the independence of Ukraine. Nationalists, extreme ones in Russia, were seeking control primarily of Crimea. There were numerous issues of industrial integration that had to be sorted out. And there was, of course, the fact that a third of the Soviet nuclear arsenal was on Ukrainian territory. But all of these were more or less sorted out by the so-called Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Russia pledged to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, while Ukraine relinquished its entire nuclear arsenal. These were the years of Boris Yeltsin as president of Russia. He had his faults, but he never wavered in his basic belief in democracy and in respect for the nations that had gained their independence after the dissolution of the Soviet state. Then, in 2000, came Vladimir Putin. He has repeatedly said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of our times, thus making it clear that in his belief, Ukraine and other nations should not have been allowed to become independent. In his opinion, it was only the weakness of the Russian state at the time that made this possible. And if we look at Vladimir Putin and Ukraine, we find since then 3 periods of profound crisis and eventually outright war. The first was in 2004, as Putin had thrown the support of the Kremlin behind the efforts of old-style Ukrainian politician Yanukovych to win the presidency of the country. But when it became obvious that the vote, well after Putin had congratulated Yanukovych extensively, was based on a massive vote fraud, the popular reaction led to the so-called Orange Revolution, eventually new elections, and eventually the victory of pro-Western Viktor Yanukovych as president. It was widely, and it was rightly, seen as a severe putback or setback for Putin's intentions and policies. He had misjudged Ukraine, a pattern that was to be repeated. Later, Yanukovych, indeed, in free and fair elections, was elected president of Ukraine, but then decided to continue key parts of the pro-Western policy of the previous administration. After having repeatedly and intensely knocked on the doors of the European Union, the country under Viktor Yanukovych managed to negotiate an association agreement and a far-reaching agreement on deep and comprehensive free trade with the EU. This was not, distinctly not, to the liking of Vladimir Putin. He had by then returned to power after the Medvedev interlude in the Kremlin, and he was determined to have Ukraine inside the semi-imperialist so-called Eurasian Union that he had launched as his strategic project, including Ukraine, was absolutely central to that effort. And from the summer of 2013, he started a series of measures to put extreme pressure on Yanukovych not to sign the Europe agreement. But when Yanukovych, faced also with the consequences of thoroughly failed economic policies, caved into the Putin pressure, this led to an eruption of massive popular protest centered on the Maidan Square in central Kiev in the beginning of 2014. And it was the violent efforts of Yanukovych, with the active encouragement of Putin, to put an end to these efforts that led in a couple of days to more than 100 persons being killed in the streets of Kiev and the entire country on the verge of breaking down. On February 21st that year, with the help also of the foreign ministers of Germany, Poland, and France, and with the Russian presidential representative also present, a deal was reached between Yanukovych and the protesters to end the crisis. Presidential elections were brought forward, the constitution given a more parliamentary orientation, a broad new coalition government set up, and it was stated that those responsible for the killings should be held accountable. The crisis seemed to be over. But instead of staying and signing the necessary document, late that very evening, Yanukovych hastily left Kiev and later clandestinely was smuggled to Russia. Without a president to sign the different documents, the parliament still proceeded to use its power to take the decisions to implement the agreement, with the exception of the absence of the president made necessary. It was done to the letter of the agreement and to the letter of the constitution. I'm mentioning this in some detail, since in the year since, the Kremlin has repeatedly talked about there having been a coup and chaos in Kiev. There was nothing of the sort. After days of massive protest and brutal killings, constitutional order was restored and calm immediately returned to the streets of the city. But if there was no coup in Kiev, there was obviously a crisis in the Kremlin. And it was then that President Putin, as is later admitted, took the decision to militarily take over Crimea. In the early hours of February 27, a Russian Special Forces unit took over the regional parliament in Simferopol on Crimea, installed a local thug with extremely limited support in previous elections, and eventually engineered the annexation of the peninsula to Russia. Not content with this, the Russian efforts then continue with a massive organized attempt to destabilize all of Ukraine, eventually take over southern Ukraine and declare a semi-independent state of Novorossiya. The Ukrainian army and the police were in shambles. But since the popular support for the massive Russian efforts was virtually non-existent, they managed to push back the Russian efforts. And in late summer 2014, that left Putin with no choice but to send in regular Russian battalion battle groups in order to save what could be saved. And that is how the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk were created. Their governance is opaque in the extreme, with leaders appointed and demoted as a consequence of faction fights in Moscow, sometimes just being killed. And as for peoples, the tragic fact is that a majority of them are no longer there, having fled primarily to Ukraine. But in essence, Putin failed again in 2014. He has misjudged the country again. Ukraine went forward with a far-reaching agreement with the EU. Its democracy survived, its economy revived, but aversion and even hostility to Russia naturally deepened. There was a ceasefire, but time after time, fighting erupted again. And since then, and prior to the outbreak of this war, the low-scale war between the gangster republics and Ukraine left no less than 14,000 dead during those years. The Russian invasions of 2014 had profound effects not only in Ukraine, but also on NATO. In the Kremlin narrative of the past few years, it's often been talked about NATO forces and installation coming closer and closer into the borders of Russia and the threat that this would represent. But there was nothing of that sort prior to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. When different countries of Central and Eastern Europe had been admitted to NATO in 1997 and 2004, there wasn't even seen the need to make up any defense plans for them. There was, at the time, often a rather constructive relationship between NATO and Russia, some tension over the Kosovo War. But NATO countries continue to reduce their defense expenditure. There are no permanent non-national forces stationed in any of the new member states. And in 2013, the United States even shipped the very last of the tanks its army has had in Europe since, 1942 or something like that. The attention of NATO was elsewhere, notably Afghanistan. But the invasion of Ukraine in 2014 changed this, and NATO started to take different actions that were necessary to give reassurance to its members. By his aggressive actions, Putin had revived NATO and made Ukraine even more determined to seek closer cooperation with the West. I think historians will spend a long time to discuss what made Vladimir Putin launch this latest and profoundly more dramatic act in the drama. He had started to adjust his military forces for Ukraine continues already early. But in July of last year, he published a remarkable essay which tried to use history to make the case that there was no real Ukraine independent from Russia. The essay, even more remarkable, was widely distributed inside the Russian armed forces. He had made clear his strategic intent to get control of Ukraine. Perhaps it was the somewhat less than glorious US retreat from Afghanistan that convinced him that the time was there. The US was weak. He could be pressured into concessions. In October, he started a massive military buildup. In November, he said that he might give diplomacy a short chance to do something. And in December, he presented a series of demands so extreme and so unrealistic that they were, in all probability, designed to be rejected. It was clear that he would either have to back down substantially, which was unlikely, or seek to achieve his aims by military force. It was never about Donbass. It was hardly about NATO membership or cooperation. But from the beginning, it was about Ukraine as a whole. The July essay was telling. Following his policy disasters of 2004 and 2014, he probably realized that there was the risk of the country turning even more to the West, slipping even more from the grip of the Kremlin, and strengthening its democratic orientation even more. He feared that he was going to go down in the history of Russia as the leader that lost all the gains of Catherine the Great, and some even of Peter the Great. And in this, of course, he was essentially right. He was on a losing track, essentially brought about by his own policies, and that he couldn't accept. Now, he believed was opportunity to turn it around. We are now 2.5 weeks into the war. It's clearly not going according to plans. The plan was to capture Kiev in 2 days, to decapitate the Ukrainian political leadership, install a puppet regime that would proceed with what Putin called the demilitarization and denazification of the country, meaning establishing complete security and political control. President Zelensky was described officially as a drug addict and Nazi, indicating how he intended to deal with him. But even though the vast bulk of the Russian armed forces are now been deployed, progress has been slow. There are reports of perhaps a third of the units of the invading forces now having very serious difficulties. And far from collapsing, the Ukraine nation has united in resistance under President Zelensky. Western support, also with arms deliveries, has been strong. And the EU and US sanctions and other measures against Russia have vastly exceeded expectations. The human costs are staggering. And many thousands have perished already. Cities have been destroyed. And soon it's more than 3 million people, mostly women and children, that have been forced to flee their country. Europe is facing its by far biggest refugee challenge since the Second World War. What will happen in the next few weeks is difficult to predict. Thousands more will die. Millions more will probably flee. Cities will be pulverized by the firepower of the Russian army. The only thing that's certain is that Vladimir Putin can't win. His insane gamble with the future of his country is likely to result in a Russia that is much weaker, far more isolated, and less likely to survive in present forms than before. If he was seeking to secure his place in Russian history, I think he's done it by now. Even in the best of military scenarios for the Putin invasion, he will be burdened with the immense cost of occupying a profoundly devastated Ukraine, having a severely degraded economy for decades to come, and be treated as a pariah by most of the civilized world. An increasingly repressive Putin regime might well survive for some time, deprived of much of the talent of Russia, but will struggle, ruling Russia in distinct decline and cut off for much of the rest of the world. The full strength of the sanctions is likely to remain until sovereign Ukrainian state within its recognized international borders has been restored. A possible puppet regime in Kiev will be treated as such. Probably, Beijing will try to help, at least for some time. But how far will Xi Jinping go in endangering his relations primarily with Europe to save a Putin regime with an economy that is likely to be approximately 5% of the Russian economy? Over time, it might be a useful colony for some raw materials, but really nothing more than that. And meanwhile, the Atlantic Alliance, as well as the European Union, is likely to strengthen and deepen their cooperation. Now we will see NATO forces stationing well into the east of Europe. There will be the need to deepen security cooperation in Europe, with the US, and across the world. Russia will end up to be weaker, but it will be more dangerous. Because it will, for some time to come, have a regime increasingly driven by desperation because of its weakening and its loss and its insane capital. The dangers will be profound. The only other thing, and I close on that, that is certain, is that the long-term effort of Putin to say that Ukraine doesn't exist will be a miserable failure. By his different actions, he has created a much more unified, a much stronger Ukrainian nation. And be that wherever, in faraway countries, under temporary occupation for some time, or in continued fight for its future, it will be a much stronger Ukraine that will have the solidarity and support of large parts of the world. So dramatic, tragic months, weeks and months are ahead of us, but a long-term future for the West doesn't look that bad after all. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister Bildt. You ended on a much better note than I thought you might, but
Yeah, but just a sentence there.
of course. One of the things I wanted to ask, and you painted a very compelling picture of Putin's motivations, but nevertheless, in the weeks leading up to it, I think a lot of people thought that he would come somewhat short of war.
Yep.
And also partly because people expected that Putin was a master chess player. That we had this idea of Putin as someone who understood the heartbeat of the world, and he was manipulating us. Clearly, he made some miscalculations. What did we, as the West, misunderstand about Putin?
I'm not certain we misunderstood it, but there's a difference between Putin playing sort of foreign policy with the United States, with the Philippines, with Sweden, with Venezuela, and whatever, Syria, and this. Because what has been happening is that, and it's interesting if you go through his sort of speeches and his public performances during the last few years, he's devoting far more time to the past of Russia than to the future. He's been diving down in history. And what I described, that he sees Russia losing things in areas that he considers central to his vision of his particular empire. And that's become an obsession. And I think that obsession has been fairly clear when you've seen what he's said, and has nothing to do with sort of what Russia does as a diplomatic and rational actors in other areas. It is completely this. And here there's a battle in Russia, you can say, between two different concepts of the future of it. The one, which is sort of, say, Boris Yeltsin, was, I want to build Russia. I mean, don't forget that Boris Yeltsin became president of the Russian Federation, or the Russian state inside the Soviet Union. and wanted Russia to be independent from the Soviet Union because he considered the Soviet Union to be a burden for Russia. He wanted Russia to be Russia. And he wanted the rest of them to go independent. That is not the Putin vision. He's deeply embedded in trying to recreate this Tsarist 19th century great Slavic empire. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, has a statue of Catherine the Great, or had, when someone was last there, in his office. And I think the sort of foreign policy community, be that in Europe or the US, missed that particular aspect of it, because it ain't really his foreign policy. It's sort of his vision of what Russia is in Eurasia.
And to flip that around, to describe this obsession and going on for easily a decade, and yet the invasion has been so, from a layperson's perspective, catastrophic.
Yeah,
for him.
Absolutely.
What did he, aside from the strength of the Ukrainian people and all that, what in particular did he get wrong?
Well, most things, to be precise. I can go on for some time. But as I tried to explain with both in 2004 and 2014, and I found that rather striking during those particular days, that I found it rather striking that why can't they understand Ukraine? I mean, they speak virtually the same language. They have a lot of history and culture. They should be able to understand each other. But then, in order to explain this to myself, or create a model trying to explain to myself, I thought about the relationship between Sweden and Denmark. We are very close to each other. We do understand each other. We have, if you go back in time, slightly complicated history, but sort of, nice friends. Danes are essentially nice people. But if you get the politics of Denmark and the politics of Sweden trying to understand each other, that's always been fairly difficult. Why is that? I think the theory is that we believe, because everything is so similar, we believe that we are closer than we are. And accordingly, we don't understand the importance of the differences, and then we misunderstand. That's my only explanation why he, 2004, fundamentally misjudged Ukraine. 2004, even more catastrophically misjudged Ukraine. And this time, even more catastrophically misjudged Ukraine. He does.
Do you think he actually believed that he would be welcomed by some population?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's awareness in Western circles of some of these preparations, and that they were for completely different reception. Wow. And it was the same, and I was more deeply involved. I was directly involved in the 2014. We knew a fair amount of what they were doing. I mean, it's amazing. They expected sort of a popular rebellion and people to welcome them, and they'd be able to take over substantial parts of Ukraine without any major effort. And they were profoundly surprised. And that goes back to sort of and to be fair to Putin, which is sort of slightly difficult, but he's not entirely alone. You find a lot of Russians who really have sort of difficult accepting that Ukraine is an independent nation. They have the concept that this is something that belongs to Russia. And same Belarus, same thing, obviously.
Yeah. We've heard a lot in the last, well, certainly the last month, about what this means for NATO and how, but I wanted to, especially given your work with the European Union, what does it mean for the European Union? Now we have Ukraine, demanding or begging for acceptance to the EU. Does this change dynamics for the European Union?
Oh, it will. The question is how. I think one small good thing, see how far, is that we see Brussels and London starting to talk to each other. So you might have heard of this Brexit thing. So we don't go there. But since it's obvious that we are now in the same boat more, there's more talk there. There's been, transatlantic relationship is always up and down, but distinctly extremely good cooperation and coordination between Europe and Washington on this particular issue. I think that remains. There will be a significant uptick in defense spending in Europe. That will also ease the transatlantic relation in the sense that I think that will be easier to discuss some sort of, I wouldn't call it burden sharing, but something along those lines. I mean, we will be dependent in Europe still on certain key American military capabilities, notably the nuclear field and some others. But with increased European resources, there might be an easier discussion to have across the Atlantic. I think we need to rearrange structures to see what happens with Sweden and Finland if they join NATO. That's a separate discussion. If that happens, you have to rearrange the security structures of all of Northern Europe. We need to, EU, we now have applications for membership from Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, the countries of the so-called Eastern Partnership. We need to look very carefully at that. There was a meeting of the EU heads of state and government in Versailles, of all places, on Thursday, Friday. They managed to do one of these compromises. I know them well because I've been doing lots of those over the years, where we said, okay, they applied for membership. We do as we normally do. We send it to the Commission and they will issue the thing. That's sort of the normal procedure, and we do it somewhat faster. But they added another sentence. In the meantime, we do a significant deepening of the relationship with Ukraine. So we need to see how we do that. We need to take care about Moldova, which is a very small place in between Ukraine and Romania, which is now extremely exposed to inflow of refugees. And we have this Russian state, the Transnistria as well, which is in the danger zone. So we have to do a fairly big rethink of our security presence in the East, depending on the outcome of the war, which will take some time.
Do you expect to see a kind of flourishing of a pan-European sentiment, a solidarity, aside from just the security question, in the same way that, I think about after, in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, or in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there was a sensibility that you were in this together. And I think Europe had fallen apart in that sense.
I think that will happen. Clearly, I mean, the relationship with Russia has been a discussion that has been a sort of issue that's been discussed forever, and there's been somewhat different nuances, to put in those terms, between the European countries. Of course, if you are Latvia, you have a slightly different view of Russia than if you are Portugal. And you have a slightly different view of Brazil as well, by the way. I mean, sort of people look in different directions, or nations look in different directions due to their historical experience. And that tension has been there. I think a lot of that tension is gone. Because here we are talking not just of the Russians doing a couple of things that you can criticize, but doing something that is so massively outrageous and barbarous that it's, I haven't been there in Europe since the war started, but I just saw quite amazing sort of video. Italy, my wife is Italian, so I see somewhat more Italian stuff. Italy has been sort of in between. I mean, Berlusconi and others have been playing around with Putin, and Matteo Salvini, the opposition leader, has been in the Red Square with T-shirts with Putin. I mean, it's sort of, now there was a video of 2 Ukrainian girls, refugees, coming into school in Italy and being received. Amazing outpouring of sympathy. And these things change policies over time.
Yeah, I saw that. That video was wonderful. All the students greeting them. It felt like something from the early 90s. The question I think that a lot of people have, and this may be something that you think is an obvious answer one way or the other, but can Putin survive this? This is something that, again, is different from previous, say, if this were a Soviet leader, you would think immediately, well, the inner circle will replace him.
Yeah, that's the problem.
But there is no real inner circle that can replace him in that sense.
No, I'm not going to say, or if I say it, forget that I ever said it, the Soviet Union was a better thing, because it wasn't, but they did have institutions. I mean, there was a Politburo, there was a Central Committee, people were outvoted. They threw out Khrushchev, for example, after the sort of 1962, all of that. He was outvoted in the Politburo a year later. There's nothing of that sort. Right. I think he has consolidated the support in a very, very narrow circle. with primarily the security structure. The government as such doesn't exist. It's a security state. Can that security state survive? Yeah, I think unfortunately it can survive for quite some time. He has the instruments of repression, which are substantial. He will have huge difficulties handling the economy. He will have huge difficulties handling dissent in the structures. As long as he controls television, he controls significant part of public opinion. But Russia is a complicated place. I mean, it's 140 million people, it's 11 time zones. You require a fairly competent bureaucracy to run the place. And that fairly competent bureaucracy has to be said. There's a lot of what I call liberal technocrats in Russia to run the state. They will be either gone or profoundly disillusioned. And the threat that they face is going to come from them sooner or later. But I fear it's later rather than sooner.
Yeah. Let me take a couple of questions. We have a few from the audience here. The first is, this is from, we'll start with a question from Zoom and then we'll move to the audience. How should the European Union change its attitude and approach towards Serbia, given the government's reaction to the invasion of Ukraine? It's interesting.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, we'll see where the government of Serbia, or the president of Serbia, to be precise, ends up on this one. He's been all over the place. There's a historic link between Serbia and Russia that goes back to two things, really. 1914 and the Second World War. That one, it goes also back to the Second World War, and it goes back to the Kosovo War and the NATO bombing of Belgrade, which I think was a profound mistake, but that lives. So and then there's an element of Orthodox solidarity, not that the Serbs are particularly religious, but anyhow, you have that. So he's been, and Vučić is facing an election, so he's been maneuvering and said, well, we criticize it, but we are not going to be part of the sanctions. I think he will receive some very tough messages from Brussels on that, because if you want to be a member of the European Union, you are a member of something that is forging a common foreign policy. And then you must, as a part of an accession process, and that's part of the formalities of it, you must align your foreign policy with the foreign policy of the European Union. So we will have to face a choice of either doing that or not doing that, with the consequences that will have.
Just to tag on to that quickly, do you think that China faces a somewhat analogous situation where they obviously want to have relations with both, and it seems like it's going to come to a point pretty soon where China will have to make a choice? Or do you think that that's maybe overblown?
Well, they would obviously try to balance this. I mean, the assumption, and I think you saw Jake Sullivan saying it yesterday, is that, or the day before yesterday perhaps, is that Putin informed Xi Jinping that he was going to do something. But Xi Jinping probably got the Putin version of it. That is 2 days, flags waving, peace in our time. Something along those lines. And they now find themselves in a situation where that did not turn out to be the case, where fairly massive sanctions are coming, where Putin will say to China, you help me out. And I think they have had an element of preparation for that. But where the Americans and the Europeans say, well, you really don't, because if you do, we'll do the same thing to you. And although, of course, the Chinese economy, as I indicated, is it's an entirely different league from the Russian economy, it will be uncomfortable. And exactly how uncomfortable it will be for the Chinese leadership remains to be seen, and how they maneuver. I think the meeting today in Rome between Jake Sullivan and his counterpart is going to be, I don't think anything dramatic is going to come out of it, but it's going to be interesting.
Do we have audience questions? Yes, and if you could step to the microphone, please.
Hi, sir. My Is this fine? My name is Shashank, and I'm an MA and an MBA student here. We just came back from Poland and Hungary just yesterday and met quite a few Ukrainian refugees there. One of the laments that the region there had was Western Europe's response, whether it's on the military side, economic, or diplomatic side, to the whole situation in Ukraine, and the fact that there could be many different ways that it could be done. So my question to you is, what do you think? First of all, what do you think about the response of Western Europe, specifically, perhaps Germany and some of those countries and Scandinavian nations? And what could have been done differently, thinking about how this could change the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe and then Western as well?
I didn't quite get it because with this face mask, it's become difficult.
If you'd like to,
You are allowed to.
Yeah.
So my question based on that background was, what do you think about the Western European countries' response on either diplomatic, military, or economic sanctions side? And if things could have been done differently, or anything that you think should have been done differently, specifically since that this has been going on for 2.5 weeks and could change the geopolitical landscape of the entire region?
Well, what's going to happen on the sanction side is going to be sort of, no one knows what's going to happen. I mean, that's the first part of the answer. We are 2.5 weeks, and everyone has been concentrating on doing things that are needed for today and possibly for tomorrow, and possibly for the day after tomorrow. But long-term thinking on these issues is so far, no one has the time to do that. Sanctions will continue to be ramped up, and they will remain for a very long time. They will have to be combined with significant economic help to Ukraine, very significant economic help to Ukraine. And they will have to be combined, I'm like slightly outside the question, with also weapons deliveries. So what's been the focus of policy so far has been to really shift the balance of things between Russia and Ukraine. Sanctions heavily against Russia, financial and military support to the Ukraine that is fighting, and then hoping that that can sort of stop the entire thing, or at least delay it, or at least complicate it, until such time as one arrives at a situation where there might be possible some opening for some sort of diplomacy. But we are not there yet.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So it seems that Russian economic decline and thus sort of geopolitical decline has been inexorable for decades now. And certainly from today's context, that's not good for anyone. It's not good for Russia or for its rivals. You could see this war as a symptom of it. Is there another way for the West than to just continue to isolate, surround with EU and NATO affiliates, and keep a misbehaving Russia down?
Well, in theory, but not in practice, because the other way that is available is, of course, the military one. But it so happens that Russia is equipped with nuclear weapons. I mean, make the comparison with sort of Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. That was a fairly minor thing if we compare to what's happening now. But then you could get the unity of the Security Council and the US and others and vast military forces, and after a while they simply sort of expelled Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. From the point of international law, exactly the same thing should be done here. I mean, highly theoretical. But of course, he has nuclear weapons. That means that that sort of military option ain't there. And then you are left with the economic option as the only way we have in order to increase the price for Russia of aggression. You can say diplomacy to a certain extent, but it's primarily what the Russians now say is economic warfare, essentially correct. It is economic warfare. Is this bad? Of course it's bad. As you say, a weak Russia, which we will have, it will be a weaker Russia. I'm talking as representative of a coming country that is not quite neighbor, but nearly neighbor. We want to have as a neighbor a stable, predictable Russia. We don't want to have an unpredictable, unstable, and desperate Russia. But that's where we're heading. And I think that's unavoidable, at least for a period. And the task of our policies in Europe or Sweden or wherever it is to create a stable structures that we can in order to handle the uncertainty coming out of a weaker and perhaps even a desperate Russia for some time to come. It is certainly not something that we like or would have wished, but is an unavoidable consequence of what's happening.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your speech.
You're
And-
allowed to take the mask off as well. I
Okay.
mean, if I'm sort of interfering with the governance of the university.
Just to add to the previous question, I think that the current sanctions mostly impacts like ordinary people in Russia who are trying to like rival, and they're being like put into jails for doing so. While I think, for example, for Europe, maybe there could be like different types of sanctions that would directly impact Putin and like the oligarchy. For example, there are a lot of like mansions and houses that they own in like Britain, or a lot of their bank accounts are like in Switzerland. And do you think like there are any actions towards impacting Putin and the oligarchy, or like doing sanctions that are primarily like focused on oil and gas export?
Yeah. Yeah, you see a lot of media about the sanctions against oligarchs, their yachts and their villas and whatever. I'm not against those, but in all honesty, I don't think it makes much of a difference. I mean, if a couple of oligarchs lose a couple of yachts, it's not that Putin is going to collapse because of that. He couldn't care less. And these guys, it's not that they go bankrupt. They will be able to pay the grocery bills anyhow. But of course, you might argue, and that is argued, and I think that's a valid argument, that a lot of the money going into this extreme luxury that we've seen, extreme luxury. We have a summer house in Croatia. So I see each summer when I see the absolutely biggest yacht you've ever seen, and we see a couple of them passing by, and I look up over the net, and it's almost always a Russian oligarch. And it's always, almost always, not always, there are exceptions. I mean, there are honest Russian businessmen as well. But it's nearly always people where I have a fair knowledge of roughly how they got their money. And it will not have worked in Sweden, if I put it in those terms. But that being said, as you say, I don't think these sanctions are particularly effective. What is effective, or what has been done, the most remarkable thing that's been done is the freezing of the assets of the Central Bank of Russia. That had never been done against a G20 country. Been done with Venezuela and Iran, but that's sort of different league. And so roughly half of the assets are not available to them. That's a significant thing. They're cut off from international financial markets. Those things will have an immediate effect. Their GDP minus 10% immediately. Some people say more than that. Inflation 50, 70%. The ruble, now markets have been closed in Russia since the beginning of the war, but the ruble is down very significantly. What is going to be even more painful for them long term is the technology restrictions. One is going to sort of deny them sort of chips and quite a number of other components. That has no immediate effect, but it has a significant long-term effect on the possibility of Russia to develop as an industrial country. And they need that. Because at the moment, their economy is, of course, dependent upon oil and gas. Now, oil and gas is a problem anyhow because of climate change. And the Russians are beginning to feel the effect of climate change. And when they have the permafrost unfreezing in Siberia, things start to happen, which is uncomfortable for them as well. if the Europeans do what they say, they're going to substantially cut imports of Russian gas. You don't do that overnight, but it's a lot of money. And you can say that you can sell that to someone else. Well, building pipelines to Siberia ain't done overnight either. And the Chinese are not, they're not in the welfare business. They're rather tough customers when it comes to negotiating prices. So that particular sector will take a significant hit. Russia will survive as an economy, no question about that. Iran is still there. Venezuela is still there, but Venezuela is a profoundly miserable place. And Iran, which has a different sort of economy, is still there, although under significant sanctions. But that is not the Russia that Putin promised his electorate that he was going to build. And we should not forget that Putin started out as an economic reformer. I mean, what he did during the first few years wasn't too bad, wasn't bad at all. I mean, he did some stupid things, but essentially, then he was extremely lucky because he had 10 years of very high oil prices, and he could deliver a sort of increase in personal consumption, personal disposable income, but more than 10% a year for a decade. He's not been able to do that for some time, and he will now have to run a country where it have to administer significantly reductions in personal disposable income for the emerging middle class of Russia that was really hoping that they were going to go into different leagues in terms of their prosperity in their future. It's tragic. I mean, the most tragic thing is IKEA, you might know this furniture thing. I don't know if you've tried it, but anyhow. IKEA in the beginning of the 90s opened up in Russia and invested heavily in that. That was for very many Russians a sign, really. It was far more than providing them with bookshelves and things like that. It was a sign of coming out of the drab Soviet life. And now IKEA is closing down everything, laying off 15,000 people in 10 mega store facilities all over Russia. I mean, these are tragic things because I wouldn't say that McDonald's is in the same league. You can survive without McDonald's fairly well, in my opinion, by the way. But when McDonald's opened up in Moscow in those years as well, it was a symbol of something happening. And now we see all of these things disappearing. And this, by the way, is not sanctions. This has nothing to do with sanctions. This is individual business across the world, primarily Europe, saying it's toxic. Our customers will not accept that we make business with Russia any longer. And that effect is fairly profound at the moment. And even if there is peace and happiness tomorrow, which is somewhat unlikely, I think it's going to take a long time for them to go back to Russia. Or tragic. And as I said, Putin has secured his place in Russian history.
All right, well, I think we'll close it there. I want to thank you, Prime Minister Bildt, for your very insightful comments. I think everybody can come away from this, if not necessarily feeling better about the situation, certainly much more informed. I also want to offer a real thank you to President Wendell Pritchett for his kind introductory remarks. Obviously to all the audience here and online. Just a few programming notes. Tomorrow, March 15th at 5:30, we will feature Iranian-born filmmaker and artist Shirin Neshat for the Susan T. Marks Distinguished Lecture Series. This event will take place at Perry World House and will also be live streamed on Zoom. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on the Perry World House YouTube channel, and you can find out about all the great events we have planned for the rest of the semester by joining the mailing list and following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll drop links to all of those in the chat as well. And for those joining us in person, everybody here, please proceed to the student lounge for a snack. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Just one more time, a round of applause for Clay Rise and the New York Times for moderating. And for Prime Minister Bildt. I mean, we all got a lot smarter about the largest land war in Europe since World War II. And it's horrible, but I'm incredibly grateful to have you both here to teach us about it. So thank you.